Hi, my name is Jenny Lauren Dowden for Conduit News, and today we have Representative David Ray joining us. David Ray is from House District 69, and he is joining us to talk about his overall impression of session and some of the really good bills that he ran this session. A lot of them had to do with tax cuts. Unfortunately, some of them didn't make it through, but we're going to talk about why that happened. Hi, Representative. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, good morning, Jenny. Good to be with you.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here to talk about some of these bills. First of all, before we dive in to talk about this, just give us your overall impression of the session and how you think it went.
Yeah, so it's still sort of the dust hasn't settled yet. I may have my views may change on this over time, but it was a little bit like a roller coaster, I think. There were a lot of ups and some downs along the way. I think in the end, there were some things that I wish had happened that didn't happen, but um, I still feel like we got some good conservative policy done for folks in the state of Arkansas. If you look at, for example, getting rid of the good work that was done on DEI, basically getting rid of affirmative action in our laws, and also the other bill by Representative Carolyn Brown that got rid of racial and sex-based quotas on state boards and commissions. There was a whole package of anti-China legislation. We've continued to push back against our biggest adversary on the world stage here in Arkansas. And then there were several bills that dealt with the subject of illegal immigration and helping mitigate some of the bad effects of those. Those are two topics, China and illegal immigration, that are ultimately going to have to be solved at the federal level by
Yeah.
our national government. But states aren't completely powerless, and so we can and should do what we can to help in that arena. And we did some good things on those fronts. I think that conservatives would appreciate.
I think so too. And since you brought this up, one thing that really surprised me that could not get out of the Senate, it passed House easily, and I believe it was, and I may be wrong. We can look it up later, but it was Senator Blake Johnson's and Representative Brett McKenzie's bill against foreign lobbying, China and Russia. I think Senate Bill 61. I'm probably wrong. Easily passed the House with you guys. I believe they had to vote on it three separate times. They brought it back the very last day of session. They could not get it passed in the Senate. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Jenny. That was the one bill out of that anti-China package that didn't make it across the finish line. I'm not really sure why it was voted down in the Senate. I don't remember it being particularly controversial when it came through on the House side. I certainly didn't feel like that was a controversial vote to ban entities from that are affiliated with the Chinese Communist Party from paying lobbyists in our state. But as you know, when we're voting on 75 bills, that's kind of hard to track what's going on in the Senate. So I didn't really get to
Yeah.
listen to that debate and see what their hangup was. But that's a vote that those senators will have to explain to their constituents, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think so. Let's talk about some of the bills that you filed. As we mentioned, a lot of good tax bills. Of course, Conduit appreciates those. We focus on economic freedom, limited government. And so we tracked several of those that you filed. One of the ones that we were surprised really failed on the floor was House Bill 1636, and that one phased out the sales tax on soda. Talk to us about that one.
Yeah, it was actually the excise tax on soda that we were trying to repeal. So a lot of people don't know this, but soda is double taxed in Arkansas. You pay the full freight on the regular sales tax, but you also pay a special excise tax. And we're the only state in the country that has this goofy tax. I mean, this is the kind of nanny state, big government stuff that Michael Bloomberg has pushed around the country for decades that we've made fun of. And yet,
Yeah.
here in Arkansas, we have this additional tax that generates about $40 million a year. And it is a strain on a lot of our small businesses, especially if, our restaurant owners, convenience store owners, grocery stores, all the average family spends about $300 a year on those products that get taxed like that. This was enacted um, in 1992, as it was intended to be, a temporary tax, and it just never went away. And so here
Yeah.
we are 33 years later. We're the only state in the country that has it. So I was working to repeal that. It gets to be a confusing issue because over the years they've commingled the tax revenue with the Medicaid funds, and ultimately I think we just didn't lay enough groundwork in terms of educating the members on all that because it was late in session, and when all the lobbying starts happening, people get easily confused as to what are we doing here? Why are we doing it? And so I think that was just one that I think the support is there to get rid of that, honestly. But it's just going to take more educating our members and bringing people up to speed on the history of how we got here, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. And I've heard other legislators say that. I was watching committee and you mentioned Medicaid. Janet Mann, she's DHS Medicaid secretary. She was there in her official capacity, spoke against losing that earmarked funding. And she said a comment that was somewhat striking. And it was whenever you were asking her a question, and she specifically said that she was there speaking against losing what was going to be deposited into her trust fund. And I thought, oh, and I know it was probably just, she misspoke and she was talking about the money that she had for, Medicaid. But I thought, this is a problem that a lot of our Kansans struggle with is that it's not the government's money, it's taxpayer funds. And, you said your money.
Right.
What?
Yeah. I mean, that's, and again, I'm willing to give her the benefit of the doubt if she
Sure.
misspoke or whatever. But I do think that a lot of times bureaucrats in government often have that mentality that, oh, this is my money just because I have responsibility over, overseeing how it's utilized. But the reality is government has no money. It's all taxpayer money. And so the only money that government has is what it derives from taxpayers. So I just think that's a healthy perspective to keep in mind as we're voting on things. And I always try to remind myself there's a million lobbyists whose job it is to come to the Capitol and represent this interest or that interest, but there's virtually no lobbyist whose job it is to just fight for the taxpayer. And so, honestly, I view that more as my role. And so I always try to think about how is this bill or this piece of legislation going to impact the taxpayers in my state and my district.
Yeah, we appreciate that about you. Again, some of these other bills that you had, House Bill 1538, 1066, that would increase the standard deduction for income tax. They didn't get anywhere. And it seems at times, and then we look at the state income tax, we're looking at, several states around us, they've completely eliminated the state income tax. What is your thought on that? Are you concerned that Arkansas at some point will be left behind? I know that a lot of legislators, the governor, they campaigned on completely eliminating the state income tax. But when we look at government spending, when we look at the state budget being increased, when we look at legislation that was passed this session that has a lot of spending attached to it, are you concerned at all about that?
I don't know if concerned is the right word. I would say that I'm watching what happens in other states. I think it is the need for us to keep the pedal to the metal, right? We've cut income taxes three times in the last 2+ years in Arkansas, and over about just a period of just over a decade, we've gone from a 7% income tax down to a 3.9% income tax. Um, but like you mentioned, Louisiana did a big tax package that is going to get them down to 3%. Mississippi is put in some revenue triggers that, if they keep that in place, will ultimately get them to zero. We're currently ahead of Mississippi, and I think the media probably oversold what they did in Mississippi because it's going to take them, probably at least 20 years to get to where they're talking about going. However, it's important. It's a good reminder that we have to keep going and we have to keep moving forward because you're really either moving forward in the world of economic competitiveness or you're falling behind. There is no such thing as sitting still. because other states are constantly improving and trying to get
Yeah.
better. And so if you choose to sit still, you are falling behind. Um, yeah, I wish we had taken some more steps forward on lowering our income tax this session. I'm not too, like I said, I'm not too dejected or concerned about it at the moment because I do think it's very likely that we come back in either later this year or early next year in a special session and do some more income tax reductions. I have a lot of faith in our governor, Sarah Sanders, her commitment to lowering the income tax. I believe our legislative leadership, the Speaker of the House and the Senate President are both committed to continuing to lower the income tax. So we're on
Okay.
the right track. We just can't lose.
Okay.
We just can't lose sight of where we're going.
Okay, because there was a another tax cut bill, and it died in committee. And I asked that legislator. I said, what gives? It really, it was a good tax bill. It wouldn't have been that significant, but it would have offered a little bit of relief. And the response was that, well, the revenue. I was told the revenue is not there for these types of cuts right now.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I mean, if you read, there was an article in the paper the other day that indicated we're going to have a surplus at the end of the fiscal year of more than $250 million. So the state does have quite a bit of revenue at the moment. I think the general mindset among a lot of folks is because we've done 3 rounds of income tax cuts in the last 2 years, which is very unusual for a state to do that much
Yeah,
tax cutting in that short of a period, to just get past the end of the fiscal year, let the dust settle, and then sort of reevaluate where we're at from a revenue standpoint. And look, I'm in agreement that we want to cut and we want to cut responsibly. We just want to make sure, I think, that all the numbers balance before,
sure.
it's the old adage of measure twice, cut once. And I think that's really all that's going on right now is we're letting the dust settle on what we've
Yeah.
done in the previous year.
Another bill that you had a lot of questions about in committee, when you guys were hearing all of the constitutional amendments, it didn't even make the top list, but it came back at the very end of session. That was Representative Beatty's and Senator Dismang's constitutional amendment, SJR 15. It was, billed as economic development, job creation. Conduit dubbed it corporate welfare districts. Call it what you may. Some here in Northwest Arkansas call it the Walton handouts. I'm just repeating what I've heard. You had a lot of questions about it in House state agencies. It passed overwhelmingly. What are your thoughts on that bill? I know that you're not a fan. I've listened to you ask questions in House Tax and Rev, in House state agencies. Um, we know that government does not create jobs. We know that the free market is what's best for the economy. What is your thought on SJR 15, on government stepping in and offering incentives and dangling the carrot for this type of market?
Yeah, I was not a big fan of referring that amendment out to the voters. It did get referred out. Ultimately the voters are going to have to weigh in the 2026 election and decide if that's something that they want. You know, I just sort of start from the standpoint that I don't feel like our state is economically uncompetitive because we don't offer enough giveaways to
Yeah,
business. We don't offer enough sweetheart deals to politically favored businesses. I think, we're becoming more economically competitive all the time. If you look at the economic outlook index that ALEC publishes every year, over the last 4 years, we've moved up from 24th. I think we were 23rd or 24th in the country, all the way up to 10th this year. We're becoming more economically competitive, not because we're just passing more incentives for individual businesses. We're becoming more economically competitive because we're lowering our tax rates, we're streamlining the regulatory process, cutting red tape, improving our workforce, improving education. These are all the things that really, in my opinion, feed into making us more economically competitive.
yeah,
And we really just ought to focus more on that than, trying to create more incentives for individual companies to do various things. I think when you do more of that, you end up allowing the government to sort of play Shark Tank with taxpayer money by picking the winners and losers. And, as some of these incentive bills kept passing during the session, I sort of thought to myself, like, I feel bad for all these homegrown companies that didn't have the wherewithal to hire a lobbyist to come to the Capitol to get a carve out for their industry.
Yeah, I agree. And that's something that Conduit talked about over and over and over again is that government should not be in the business of picking winners and losers. But that's what so many of these bills that we saw throughout session did. That's exactly what they did. And, we tried to tell people, but, and that's what was so discouraging at times with the supermajority conservative legislature. They should be economically literate enough to know that that's not the government's role to be involved in the market that way. But nonetheless, they passed. I want to ask you just a few more things. You were supportive of the series of bills regarding ballot initiatives. I want to give you a chance to speak about that. And then I want to also couple it with um, the special session a year or so ago. Well, was that, oh gosh, when was that? When with the FOIA, was that 2023? I believe it was. With the FOIA, Representative Ray, our viewers were very unhappy with that FOIA bill, and then also the series of ballot initiatives. I think if you maybe pulled one of those ballot initiative bills out, a standalone, read the title, someone might say, just alone, that's innocuous enough, but as a whole, collectively, one would argue, that makes it really hard for the people to get something on the ballot. For our viewers who have a really difficult time understanding, and are upset about your vote on those ballot initiative bills, and then also your stance on FOIA, I just want to give you an opportunity to comment on those.
Sure. Well, I'll say a couple of things. First, on the ballot initiative bills, um, look, as conservatives, I would start from the premise that we believe in election integrity. We believe in fair, free, and secure elections. And just like we demand election security and integrity in the elections that elect our state representative or our congressman, it's also important to demand integrity and accountability in the elections where we amend our Constitution or enact policies that decide things like marijuana or casinos or abortion. And so I view this as two sides of the same election integrity coin. What we know, and this is a fact, is that our initiative process, as it currently exists, is broken. And what I mean by that is it's riddled with abuse, mistakes, duplicates, and I would argue potentially fraudulent activity. The Secretary of State's office over the last several election cycles can show you data that at a minimum on these petitions when they're turned in, there's 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, sometimes as many as 10,000 duplicate signatures. And that's just the duplicates. That's not counting the people who signed someone's name other than themselves. That's not counting the canvassers that deceived or misled petition signers. I can't tell you how many people called me over the last election cycle and said, "Hey, I was at a event and a canvasser approached me and said, 'Hey, will you sign this petition for limited government?'" And I
Mhm.
found out later it was an amendment to put abortion in our Constitution.
Yeah,
Well, that person was deceived by an unscrupulous canvasser.
yeah,
And we got reports that there were canvassers just leaving petitions to be signed in storefront windows, not even witnessing them. These are violations of the law. And so when you're talking about amending our Constitution, we've got to have some guardrails on this. And this is something that conservatives around the country are coming around to understanding. Just this week, Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida signed a big package of petition reform bills, just like the ones that we did here in Arkansas. And so, I think that, look, everyone understands that we have to have election security and election integrity. they're just not accustomed to thinking about it in this context because I don't think people are aware of all the just chicanery that goes on in this process. So that's what I would say about that. Look, on the FOIA issue from last session, I would say, look, everybody agrees that transparency is an important value in government. Um, it is something that we all value, but it's not totally unfettered. It's not completely unlimited. And there are some functional problems with our laws. Now, did we do a good enough job of explaining what those problems are and how our legislation would have addressed those? In retrospect, it's clear that we didn't do a good enough job of explaining it to people. And that's part of the process. You know, Margaret Thatcher famously said, first you win the argument, then you win the vote. I think that's important. When there's a problem with our FOIA laws, you know, like there is with the commercialization of FOIA, people using it for profit, they basically use government employees to provide them uh, records that they then use for commercial purposes. They're basically using government employees to make money for their business. You know, there are issues with things like that that we ought to address, but we've got to make the case for why that is. And I understand some folks disagree with that, and that's okay. I am perfectly comfortable living in a world where we don't always agree all the time.
Yeah.
You know, I would put my conservative voting record up against just about anybody else's. And, you know, I would say to somebody that disagrees with one or two of the bills that I've filed and advocated for, that's perfectly okay. If that
Yeah.
person was a legislator, I probably wouldn't agree with them 100% of the time either. And so
Yeah.
I'm comfortable operating in a world where somebody that I agree with 85 or 90% of the time is my friend.
Ronald Reagan rule. And, I would say that as well. Before I let you go, a few more just quick questions. What was the biggest win that you guys had in the House?
Um, you know, that's a good question. There were not as nearly as many big ticket items as we had the last session with, you know, the LEARNS Act and the school choice
Yeah.
and parole reform and all those sorts of things. I think the success of this session is just the cumulative effect of all of the smaller things we did, things that people may have already forgotten about, like the move
Mm,
to get cell phones out of the classrooms in K through 12 schools. You know, like I mentioned, the anti-immigration package. We passed our first e-verify law this session. That's a great success that hopefully we can continue to build upon. We're, I think, the only state in the Southeast that didn't have an e-verify law. The anti-China package, that was a really
yeah.
good thing. And just a lot of things that didn't get much attention. I passed a bill to reform the way that state agencies purchase public property. I mean, that's something that in the future has the potential to save taxpayers millions of dollars.
Yeah.
Never got a single article written about it because, you know, it's not one of those really controversial topics that people, um, you know, grab onto. But
Yeah.
um, I think if you look under the hood, there were a lot of good things that sort of got done in a low key manner.
Coming back next session, what do you hope to bring back and accomplish?
Well, this one just wrapped up, so it's hard to start
You always
thinking
got to be
about the
thinking
next one
ahead,
yet.
Ray. Come on. You
But,
got it.
you know, my big push has always been to try and make Arkansas the most economically competitive state that we can be,
Yeah.
because that's that is critically important for you know, working to grow our economy so that our citizens have good, high-paying jobs here in our state, so they don't have to move to Austin, Texas, or Nashville, Tennessee, if they want to find economic opportunity. So for me, that means, you know, we need to have a laser-like focus on controlling the growth and spending so that we can continue to lower the income tax, so that we can get rid of some of these other taxes, like whether it's the franchise tax or the soft drink tax or some of these things that just make us stick out from an economic competitiveness standpoint. Those will be a lot of
Yeah.
the things that I'm focused on.
Yeah. I believe was it Kavanaugh that tried to run the franchise tax, or was that Underwood? I, I can't
Um,
remember.
I know Representative Kavanaugh filed a bill. I think Representative Underwood filed one in the previous session. So
Yeah.
there's been a
Yeah.
lot of people interested in that idea.
Yeah. Yeah. So hopefully we can get some of those done. All right. It is now that session ended, we're starting to see the endorsements tweeted out, campaign reelections announced. There were some rumors of a possible Senate run for you, but no, you recently announced your reelection campaign for the House. Tell us about that.
Yeah, look, I am going to run for reelection in 2026. I'm excited to continue the work that we've started here in the House. Um, like I said earlier in the interview, 4 or 5 years ago, when I first got elected, Arkansas was ranked 23rd in our economic outlook based on those ALEC rankings. As of last week, we're ranked number 10 in the country. So we are moving the ball forward. I know there's a lot of people that don't feel like we're moving fast enough or as aggressively enough as they would want, but we're just going to keep on moving forward and seeing that progress. And it's going to be to the benefit of all Arkansans when we have a growing economy. So I feel like I'm doing good work in the House. We've got a great group of people. And we're just going to continue trying to move the ball forward for the conservative cause.
Thank you, Representative Ray, for joining us on Conduit, and hope that you come back on again soon.
All right. Thanks, Jenny. Appreciate you having me.